Hola, chicas. Love having you here on the Encuentras Your Voice podcast. I'm your host, Consuelo Crosby, coming to you every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific Time from San Francisco, California, sending a shout out to our comunidad worldwide and loving everything Latina. Here to give you some joy in midweek, abrazos for anything that may be getting to you, and manifesting a gentle life ahead. This is where you sit back, relax, and get to know your next new amiga as she unwinds her story, shares her pain points, and encourages all of us to keep going towards our dreams. Now today, even after an emotionally filled 2 hours of talking, of which you're going to hear less than an hour, there is so much more to know about Annette Chavez Macias, Latina author of Big Chicas Don't Cry, her first published novel, and one that speaks from her soul. It doesn't help that she also has an alias for her romance short stories. Sabrina Sol heightens Latina leads into an always happily ever after ending. That's not reality, you say? But it's mandatory for a romance author and a far cry from her fictional novel prowess. Or is it? Big Chicas Don't Cry is the heart-driven novel loosely based on Annette's own life and family, especially her abuelas. It follows a year in the life of four primas, inherently completely different, yet joined at the hips like siblings. This life story summons up all the feels of a lifetime of a first-gen Latina discovering herself in society that doesn't claim her, a cultura with preconceived notions, and a familia with expectations. It's a story that almost didn't get written for so many reasons. First, it took decades for Annette to let time tell the story, only to face 13 rejections after she finished the manuscript. 13 rejections. But that just shows you how valuable this story is to Annette, her 4 generations of family, and to any mujer who identifies with love, family, and following your dreams. Annette spills all the tea on how she found herself again to write the novel of her dreams, leading a first-gen oldest daughter Latina life, writing romance short stories versus novels, finding community supporting and celebrating her once, and the infamous imposter syndrome of not being Latina enough to write her own story. Find out what brought Annette to sudden tears on the episode, the long silence you will hear, and hold it in your hearts, and what her all-time binge-worthy shows are on the emotional episode of this Encuentras Your Voice podcast. Get your tissues, your notebooks, some bevies, find your favorite spot to relax, and discover your next best amiga, Annette Chavez Macias. We'd love to welcome today Annette Chavez Macias to the podcast. Thank you for sharing your time and your energy, and most importantly, for us sharing the journey of you coming all the way through your life and becoming the published author that you are. Welcome, Annette.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity and being able to share my story.
It's a full-blooded one, that's for sure. From what I discovered of you, it really is an inspiring one. So why don't you start off with sharing your upbringing, your cultural heritage, and what it was like for you?
I consider myself to be Mexican-American. My father came from Zacatecas to the United States when he was 18 years old. And my mother is second generation Mexican. She was born here in the United States, but her family is originally from Chihuahua and also Zacatecas. I grew up in Southern California, in an area called the Inland Empire. But I really did spend a lot of my childhood growing up in Los Angeles because that's where my father's mother lived and his brothers and sisters. So we would spend our week here in Inland Empire, and then on the weekends we would see my family on that side. I'm the oldest of 3 kids, so I definitely relate to that first daughter responsibilities that is very prevalent in our culture. So I was the overachiever, responsible daughter. I went to Catholic school, private Catholic school, and I was just one of a handful of Hispanic students. And so growing up, it was kind of a challenge to kind of balance that. I probably was not as proud of my heritage when I was a child and a teenager because, you're just trying to fit in. And, during that time, I grew up in the 80s. It was a different, it wasn't
different world.
Was a different world from what it is now. My mom's side of the family all lived within 5 miles of each other. So we were more about spending time with relatives. My cousins were my best friends. And we didn't do sleepovers at other people's houses.
Also part of the cultura, though.
Yes. So we're very insulated, I believe.
I see.
And I think when you're brought up that way, you have 2 responses. One, you just want to get out of there and go live your life and do your own thing.
Okay.
So for me, I came back. I still live within, 5-7 miles of my aunts and uncles and my mom. I was a big reader growing up, and my mom was a very big reader. She was a big romance reader. And so there was always books in our house, and we were always at the library because my parents both worked. So if they couldn't pick us up after school, then we walked to the library and we just hung out at the library until, 5 o'clock.
Were you raised English speaking or Spanish speaking?
I was raised English speaking because my dad did not speak English very well. Growing up in a household where my parents spoke Spanish to each other, I could understand, but I couldn't hold full conversations with them back in Spanish. Now, of course, that I'm older, I wish that I was fluent, not just because there's definitely opportunities when you're a bilingual speaker, but just the fact that for me, as I've grown up and started to have my family, it's become more important to me to be connected to my culture. And language is a big part of that. And also, sometimes you get judged when you look like me and people come up to you and expect you to speak Spanish and you can't, or you can't do it, up to a certain point. So yeah, it's been a struggle. Exactly. It's been a struggle.
Yeah, the identity issue, especially self-identity when you get older and you realize there is such a thing. And then your self-identity within the cultura is really the more profound, intimate issue when it comes to trying to figure out who you are, how do you fit in, where do you fit in, and always being a little not good enough in either camp. And none of the adults really took that piece to make sure, because they don't know. Right. They tend not to know that this is even an issue.
Right. And also, my mom grew up in the United States. She was born here. But when she was going to school, there was that stigma where you don't speak Spanish in school. So yes, she had to speak Spanish at home with her parents. But when her and my dad met, she spoke enough Spanish to talk to him. But there was some, barrier there with language because he barely spoke any English. And again, her Spanish was not the best.
But here you found yourself in the library, loving it, becoming full-blown reader. Did you think you wanted to be an author?
I think part of me did, but when I'm that young, I didn't realize, what that entailed or what that meant. I just knew that I liked to write stories.
Where did the story writing come from?
Definitely, I think from reading. Like I said, because we were so sheltered, the books gave me a way to look outside of my own world and, learn about these different things. And because my mom was a big romance reader, that was a lot of what I read. I just loved reading about these other places that I had never been to and situations that I had never experienced. And so from that, it was just a natural outlet for me to start writing my own little short stories or different poems. When you're in middle school, everything is just so dramatic.
You think?
I guess writing was my outlet to get those feelings down on paper. Even when I went to college, I knew I wanted to major in some type of communications. But, in college, they don't offer a degree in be an author. So communications is as close as you're going to get to writing, to being, part of a creative writing. And I ended up on the school paper for college. And so I think for me, yes, in the back of my head, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. But I just kind of took a little detour on becoming an author.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So you stayed with it, creating your writing from an early age and then going into it professionally. But we don't appreciate the difference sometimes on the other side, that there's your writing in your professional writing, and then there's becoming an author. What was that catalyst? What got you into becoming a published author?
It really was because of a story idea I had in my head. And after I graduated college, I was a journalist, I was a reporter. And
oh, wow.
So I did that type of writing for a while. And, that when you're, in your early 20s, being a newspaper reporter is exciting because it's never the same thing every day. It's something different every day. And so I enjoyed that. And I enjoyed telling other people's stories. And so then I went into corporate writing. And I was content with that until I was about to turn 40. And I had a midlife crisis.
Or an epiphany.
And I just kind of thought to myself, you used to want to be an author. You used to want to write your story. So what happened? And maybe, why don't you try it? Just see what happens. And I did already have a story that was in my head. But I had no idea about what that meant to write a novel. I had no idea. But I knew I just had the story that I wanted to tell. I actually didn't even have a story. I had scenes in my head.
Oh.
And so when I decided, let's do this, let's put it down, I just started writing one day, the scenes that had been in my head. And that's kind of like my process even now is I'll start with a scene and then I'll write it down and then I'll think of another scene until I have a whole bunch of unconnected scenes. And then the challenge is forming them into a cohesive story. Luckily, I had kept in contact with a woman from college, and she would post about her books coming up. I reached out to her, and I said, can you give me some advice on how I can get published? And she just wrote me this long, long message in response about everything that she had done and what she recommended I do if I was really serious about becoming an author. And so one of the big pieces of advice that she had, or she encouraged me to do, was to come to a meeting because she belonged to a writers group. It was a romance writers group because she was a romance author. And it was local. There was probably over 100.
For heaven's sakes.
Mainly women. There were, scattering a few men. But
now, is this a meeting in the romance genre?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was a romance writers group.
Okay.
So all of these people were romance authors or were trying to be romance authors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it was really, inspiring to see all these people
Mm-hmm.
who have the same dream as you. And some of them had obtained it, and some of them were just, the same level as me, just trying to do something with their, with the first book. Because I could see that other people were doing it and that there was a resource for me to use, then that encouraged me to pursue it.
So that was the community that you felt, okay, bolstered by. Like, I'm not alone in this dream and I can make it real because it's real for these people who are willing to support you, it sounds like, who are very gracious in their ideas for you. So did you start in romance? This is a romance writing group. You had grown up reading your mom's romance novels. Did you start off in romance?
I did. So my friend, who was a romance author, she actually helped me by suggesting ways that I could get published, because even though I was working on this other book, it wasn't finished. It wasn't a finished manuscript. So I was not ready to publish yet. She said, oh, by the way, one of my publishers has this series of short stories and the world is already built. They just want writers to come in and do one little story. They gave you the parameters, the requirements,
Okay.
what kind of characters had to be, and so it was easier. And that ended up being my first publishing contract, was a short story for this romance publisher. And yeah, so that's how I got started.
Yeah, so that almost had an immediate turn. As soon as you made the decision, no, I'm going to do this, it was almost a manifestation. Then everything started, not that it was easy, but at least it opened all these opportunities. And
yeah.
It was much easier than maybe what you had thought of in your own head it was going to be like.
Yes. And part of me also, because now in the romance writers community, I would hear about people who had written books and they never sold, or, it took them years to get published. And so I felt like almost like I had cheated in a way.
Or maybe we're exactly where you were always born to be.
Maybe. It's funny because, yes, for romance, it was, like you said, it wasn't easy, but I didn't struggle like I thought I was going to struggle to get that first contract. Whereas when I went into women's fiction, that was a different story. So,
okay.
So it just depends. And, nobody's one experience is going to be the same for another.
Absolutely.
So you just have to do what's right for you.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations. Now, I have a few questions. I'm a little curious.
Sure.
The romance seems to go, okay, stereotypically, I'm going to own that. But romance goes hand in hand with our cultura to begin with. Very romantic cultura. Were your characters and the storyline from the culture in the romance?
Yes, but it didn't start out that way, or in my head, I didn't set out for my characters to be Hispanic. And I think that was because of what I was used to reading. I was used to reading about white women, white men. That's what my mom read. So what I had grown up reading. And
traditionally, that's what was going to be available.
Right,
Not even traditionally, just in the system. They framed it.
Exactly.
So that's what was going to be available.
And so it was actually my friend when we were talking about, whether or not I, should write a story. And then she asked me the question, are your characters going to be Latino? And it took me a second because I had not even considered that, because I didn't know I could. And I think it was her telling me that it was a possibility, that once I realized that I could do it, then yes, I made a conscious effort. And I made a conscious decision that the books that I was going to write were going to feature specifically Latinas as the main characters. My main female characters were always and will always be Latina, because I have that opportunity to do it.
yeah, you become the voice, literally, and opening the doors, not even opening the doors, kicking down the doors, to make it more, this is what you're going to get on the shelf. And not because this is a Latina genre. It's just the romance story is with a Latina character.
Right.
And so it becomes mainstream. This becomes mainstream.
Right.
But
And I also, I will say though, I did, even though I had made that decision that yes, I was going to only write Latinas, there was, the little voice in my ear saying, but are you the right person to write Latinas? Because because I wasn't fluent in Spanish. And yes, while I had this Mexican upbringing, I also believed I came from a background or community where I'm not sure how to say this. Well, it's just, what I had heard all my life. Maybe I'm not Latina enough to write about Latinas.
yes, that's very real. It's very real and unfortunately still real today for the younger generations, even though it's more wide open. But there you are on this little precipice then, knowing with full intent that this is what you're committing to do on behalf of your own identity, but also for the community. And yet you're having imposter syndrome as an author, but you're also doubling down and having imposter syndrome within the comunidad for your own writing. Like, that's a double whammy. That's a lot to carry on, especially in creating the voice for your stories.
It was. And for example, if it came to using Spanish in the book, I had my mother or my other friends who were fluent, I would send them or I would call them up. Okay, so I want to say this. And then I would tell them, is this how you say it? I would even call my dad. And so he would tell me, no, you have to say it this way. Or so I had the resources to make sure that my characters were authentic. All of my stories are still centered or inspired by my experience and my upbringing, because that's what I know and that's what I can be confident in. And so if somebody would ever come back and say, well, that couldn't happen. Well, yes, it could, because it did.
Okay.
So for me, I think that's how I balanced it. By, on one hand, I was not confident in making sure that the pieces of culture that I was integrating in my stories were authentic and real. I made sure that the experiences were and that the emotions were, so that would come across as being authentic.
That was your, what do you call it? Like cornerstone. Like, I am Latina. This happens. I know this happens. And it's different for everybody's experiences, but it could quiet that voice giving you doubt then in the writing. This is, a little funny in that with all the novelas that were on TV, it never occurred to me, and they've been on for decades and decades here in the U.S., that there wouldn't be a more prolific exposure of romance novels with the Latino storylines. But I'm so happy that you had your family supporting you. And I don't want to jump ahead, but just a little teaser that I did notice in your book, which we will talk about soon, in the book, you need to have the Spanish dialogue in the conversations of your characters, because it just won't make sense otherwise. It just gets lost in translation if you try and say it any other way. So it was beautiful that you had this community of family and friends to incorporate that and make sure you had the authenticity in your stories. So it sounds like once you found yourself writing in your authenticity, in your authentic voice, then things really began to flourish.
Yes, I think once I had made that decision that, I was only going to write about Latina heroines, I just continued to write romance books that featured those characters, and not just them, but also the Hispanic families that they came from.
Mhm.
For me, it was more important that by showing she's Mexican American, but she also has issues with her mother. She also has issues at work, or she just wants to find somebody who understands her. So those are all universal themes and messages. So the goal for me is always, I want those themes to be what readers take away. And the fact that her heritage is Hispanic, that's secondary. That's not just all she is. Even though I was publishing romance, I was still working on this one story. And now that I was more familiar because I had joined that writing group and because I was part of the romance writer community, I knew enough to know that the book that I was writing was not a romance. And there's a big distinction for those who aren't familiar.
Not familiar. That would be me. Although I have to take it on now.
Yes.
Okay, big difference between writing romance and writing women's fiction.
Yes. So romance, the genre of romance, the one criteria or requirement is that there is a happily ever after or happy for now at the end of the book. So that means you're taking this reader on this journey of these characters who are going to fall in love. And the reader at the end of that book has to be confident or close that book knowing that these characters are going to be together forever.
Oh.
So, yeah.
I need to be a character in your romance novel.
So, for example, one of them can't die at the end. There can't be any type of like cheating scenario going on. The lines, can get blurry or have gotten blurry as more and more people enter the genre. But the diehard romance readers, that is their one thing. And they'll call you out. If they end up with that book and one of them dies, or there's a question about whether or not they're together, and they'll straight up say in the review, this is not a romance. So no, Romeo and Juliet is not a romance. It's a love story.
Okay.
Any of Nicholas Sparks' books, those are not romances. They're love stories. And because, like I said, because I was already part of this community, I knew that. And I knew that the book that I was working on was not romance. So I also knew that the book that I was working on was going to be women's fiction. And so women's fiction is more about the character's journey to discovering some truth about themselves. And because it's women's fiction, then it's, the main character's a woman. Mm-hmm. So it's her journey to basically figure out her life and, what she wants to do with it, or dealing with some type of issue. So at the end of the book, your character has gone on this journey of self-discovery.
Mm.
For people who may not be familiar with publishing, there are publishers that you cannot submit your novel unless you have an agent. And because I didn't have an agent for my romance, but I knew if I wanted to sell this women's fiction novel, I needed to find an agent first.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that was a totally new.
Oh, this is a different side of the business now. This is like the major leagues now.
Yes,
now you need
a different world. It's a different
whole
world.
Different process.
And also because it is a bigger target, that you're trying to hit.
Yeah.
I did not really find that community in women's fiction that I had in romance.
And this women's fiction, this is a good turning point for us. Okay, let's just clarify in case there's any doubt out there. You had a full-blown career, still have a full-blown career writing short stories and romance. You had been also simultaneously working on this novel, women's fiction, throughout the whole time you have a career. But you also have the career as the responsible, keep paying the bills, full-blown profession in corporate writing.
Yes.
And raising a family and being all the things. I mean, you are explosively creative and professional. Keeping things moving. My goodness, where do you find all this energy? But thank God you do, because here comes this story that you've had for decades. in your head. It's coming out in down on paper, and it does get published. We're getting to that too. What is the premise? Did you keep your authenticity? Is this written in your authentic voice? What is the premise of this story that we're talking about?
So the story that we're talking about is Big Chicas Don't Cry, which is my debut women's fiction novel. It was published in 2022. And this story, although fictional, is inspired by my family and my upbringing. And so it took me several years to just finish the book because, yes, I was, like you said, I was writing romance and I was working full time and dealing with my family. So this piece of me, I kept under wraps. This was not something I shared publicly. And it was because I think it was so close to my heart. And also because it was so close to real life, I guess.
Your reality.
My reality, that it's sometimes hard to face that. And this book is not something I could have written when I was in my 20s.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So I think that's a reason maybe why it took so long to finish. I needed to experience things and remove myself from those situations and look at them from a different lens and then translate them into a story. And I think the only reason I ended up finishing it was because through my involvement in the romance community, I had learned about a contest. So that was the inspiration I needed to finally finish the book because I wanted to enter this contest. And so I did. I finished it. I entered and I did not final, but I heard back from one of the judges and she loved the story. Her email was so long and I just was just so appreciative that she even took the time to do that because she did not have to do that. So that gave me the confidence that there was something here with this book. For the first time, I had somebody else saying, you have something. I started submitting to both agents and editors, and I got 13 rejections.
Oh, my Lord.
13 rejections. Yes.
I think you would have stopped after 2.
And so, like I had mentioned before, you always hear about those struggles to get your first book published. So this was new to me because, again, the first time I tried to publish something in romance, it got published. So this was new. And so, of course, you have that imposter syndrome again, that maybe I'm not a good enough writer. But at the same time, some of the comments in those rejection letters were, oh, I think you have a good voice, but I can't relate to your characters. And so there was that concern I had, when I was first starting out publishing. Yes, that because my characters were Latina and it was centered around a Mexican family, that it did not have an audience. And so I put the book away. I stopped working on it.
Oh, no.